All right, let's kick it off with stand up. What did we learn yesterday? What did we accomplish yesterday? What did we get more practice with yesterday?
We created a tic tac toe board with on click and different features for when you click the button.
Yep, we did the on click. We added in a new DOM function, get elements by tag. We got practice with our for loops, right, for figuring out, hey, we want to apply this to every button. We got practice with our if statements to say if the button is this information. We got more practice using IDs and linking that DOM together, right, knowing what button was clicked on. Did anything stand out yesterday? I know I read in the feedback that someone said this was making a little bit more sense than movie theater seats. And it's always a toss-up. I go back and forth of whether movie seats is better to do first or tic-tac-toe is better to do first. But were there any light bulb moments yesterday? Anything where you were like, now I get it. Now I understand what's flowing here.
Couldn't tell you when, but yeah, I did understand it better than the movie seats as well. Like the indexing makes sense to me in terms of, where you have to go to get B6 for the column and the row.
Yep.
The empty board made sense. Oh, we did random number between. That was new.
Yep, we made that function ourselves, right? Or Stack Overflow made the function and we just borrowed it from there. But yeah, definitely something we did.
And we made this so the computer could play against somebody or vice versa.
Yes, and that's where we're going to pick up. That is certainly where we are going to pick up today. So we are going to dive into our code. Before we do that, though, does anyone want to take a stab at kind of talking through this code from top to bottom as a review? Or would you prefer me to do it?
No, I'll give some of it a shot.
Sure.
We'll see. So we've got our HTML and we created buttons to represent each box of the tic-tac-toe board. We included that new and NBSP, which was the non-breaking space.
Yes.
So that we would have space in between. We wouldn't have to mess with that in CSS. Let's see, we did some CSS by going into the head and put that there for the button and minimum width. Yep. And then in the JavaScript, we came over and instead of an on-click event, instead of get element by ID, it was tag name now to connect that also with the CSS we wrote in HTML. And we've got an empty board on top. And then we needed to generate random numbers for the computer to select from. And we pulled that from Stack Overflow. I really don't understand, the process itself, but I know we got it from there.
Yeah, we don't need to worry too much about the math. It's basically coming up with a random number and then multiplying that by the range of the min and the max, and then flooring it, which means it's kind of chopping off the decimal. But there's a reason we went to Stack Overflow on that instead of, writing that out ourselves, is that's that's a function that I personally think should be built into JavaScript and is not. So that's why I just borrow that code right from Stack Overflow.
That's great. My math brain thanks you. So then we wanted to make sure that each button of the all buttons category had an on-click event, and that we could select an X in any of those spots for index 0 through 2, and each of those sub-indexes for the columns. Event target ID, if you clicked B2, it put an X into it, into row 1, index 1, and column index 1. So if I'm looking down at a little further for B6. And let's see, then we had to create random numbers for each row and column between 0 and 2, so that the game could randomly select a play. But I do get lost as to how it ends up being an O versus an X.
So right here, we use that random row and the random column we generated right here. So
Mhm.
random row is going to be 0, 1, or 2. Random
Right.
column is also going to be 0, 1, or 2. We take those two and we combine them together as the indexes, and then we set that equal to 0 or O.
So anything that's not an X would be selected as an O by the computer, because that's the computer's part, right?
This is the computer making a move, yes.
Mhm.
So what we're doing here is we're saying basically pick the indexes that the computer is going to play at, and
Mhm.
then take those indexes into our array and put an O wherever that random index is.
Okay. Great. That's all I have.
All right, that's pretty much everything. Did that shake loose any questions from anyone?
I have a question.
Shoot.
All right. I know the computer is supposed to put an O in a space that's not occupied. And I don't remember where in the code it says it's going to do that in an unoccupied space.
We have not done that yet. So I think that is a very good place to start, right? So what's
Okay.
happening is that we're picking a random row and a random column and then just putting it in there. Well, we're not checking to see if that spot is already taken. So what we could do, and before I go any further, give me 1 second. I'm going to move this into a day 2 folder. Let me go to my code, week 10. I'm gonna duplicate this as a day 2. I will also make a zip and send this along in the live stream channel. If you are going to try and follow along today and would rather use my code instead of your own code, you are more than welcome to do that. Or you are welcome to keep working on your existing code. Let me pop open the day 2. And get rid of this one. Got my day 2 going on here, my script, my index, and let's go. Okay, snapping does not want to work for me tonight. That's cool. Okay. I'm going to go live, and I will also drop the live share link into Slack if you need to join. And I'm just going to move this over for now. Give everyone a minute to open up that live share link if you normally do before we dive in. See everyone joining in here. Are we good to go? Anyone need another minute? Okay. So the question that Artrell asked was, hey, we're picking a random number here, but we're not checking to see if that spot is taken yet. The computer can't just take any spot, can't pick any random spot. It needs to only take a spot if there is not already an X or an O in there, right? Because if there is an O in there, it needs to pick another spot, even though it played there already. So what we can do is we can write an if statement that says if the board random row that we just generated and the random col we generated does not equal a empty space, then we need to generate a new number. So we would say random row equals random number between. And don't follow me on this code quite yet, because we're going to make another revision to this. So we're going to say random col, random number between 0 and 2. I'll let you know when you can follow along with this code. Does anyone see a problem with this implementation? Basically, we're saying generate a random number, go to the board, and see if that random number, that random row and that random column does not equal an empty space. If it does not equal an empty space, that must mean there is an X or O in that position. So go generate another random row and column and then put the O there.
But we also know where there's an empty space, where it is equal.
Where it is equal, we just don't run the generate a new one.
Okay.
So
Right.
does it need directions on what to do if there is something there?
So if there is something there, it's going to do this code, because we're saying if it's not equal to an empty space, then we need to generate a new random row and column and basically find another space to go.
I think
If there
maybe
is,
like, oh, I'm sorry, you can go over.
no, go ahead, hon.
If I was just to think, I would say maybe if you like made it to a function or something to create the random number, and then like if there's something already there, you could just run that function again.
So that's the problem with this implementation here, is what happens if we generate two random numbers, we check the board for it, and if it's not empty, we generate two more random numbers. But what's to say those new random numbers also don't have, or also have something in it already? We need some way to say, hey, we need to keep generating random numbers here until we hit a spot that we find is empty, and then we'll play that spot.
Do we need a while loop?
We could do it with a while loop. We could do it with a for loop. There are a couple ways we can do it. So this is what we're going to do instead. We're still going to use this if logic. We're still going to generate a random number. But what we're going to do is we're going to break out of the loop as soon as we have a random number that is actually empty. So what we're going to do is I'm going to do this as a for loop, only because I like to get the practice with it, but I also like to say, hey, there's a maximum time this loop should run. If this loop runs more than 1,000 times, we probably have something wrong in our code, and we're just going to pull the fail-safe button, right? If we've checked this board 1,000 different times and we still don't have an empty spot, something has gone wrong, and we should break out of the loop so we don't run into an infinite one. So I'm going to say let I equal 0. While I is less than 1,000, I'm going to give the computer 1,000 chances to find an empty spot. And then I'm going to say I++. Then I'm going to take my if statement and I'm going to say if, and I'm going to kind of reverse this. I'm going to say if the board finds an empty spot, then break out of the loop.
Okay, why 1,000?
Just a random number that is not 1,000 will still run in a couple milliseconds on the computer side. So if you picked 2, well, it may not have checked every spot in the board. So 1,000 is a number where we're saying, go check all the spots in the board by just keep on checking random numbers. And if you've checked randomly 1,000 different times and you still haven't found a spot, just give up. We probably didn't find, something's probably wrong with the code.
Okay.
So it could be 500, it could be 10,000, just a kind of a safety switch for us to be able to say, hey, this loop shouldn't really be running more than 1,000 times if it is something is going wrong there. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, if you found an empty spot on the board, break out of the loop. If you didn't find an empty spot on the board, go generate another random number and go test that to see if it's empty. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to say, we're going to do our final check. We're going to say if the board random row and random col does not equal an empty space, alert the user something went wrong making a computer move. Okay, so let's break down that code a little bit. What we do is we start with our random number between, and we store that in random row and random column. So we just pick a random spot. Then we go into this for loop. The first time I equals 0, we go to the board, we take the random row that we generated and the random column, and we check to see if it's equal to an empty string. If it's equal to an empty string, that's an empty spot in the board. We can go ahead and break out of the loop. This loop then stops running entirely. We move down here and do our check to see if that spot is empty. If it is empty, if it's not empty, something went wrong, right? This loop may have run 1,000 times. For whatever reason, we couldn't find a spot. So we say something went wrong making a move. But if we are in here and the random row and the random column does not equal an empty string, we come down to this else case. And in our else case, we say, go generate a new random number in the random row and the random column. So now we've got a new spot to check. We hit this curly brace here. We go back up to our loop. I now becomes 1. And we say, hey, go check the board now for the random row in the random column that was generated last time this loop ran. If that is empty, then we found what we're looking for and we can break out of the loop. If that spot is still taken, go up and run this loop another time. But if you've tried to check this 1,000 times and you still have not found anything, we are going to come down here and say whatever the last random row and random column we've checked for, if it is not an empty string, in other words, if it couldn't find a place to move, we're going to tell the user, hey, we couldn't find a spot to go. Something's wrong there. Okay. So I'm going to switch to the browser. And I'm going to open up my console because remember, we left ourselves a note last night that says for future self, the array is updating in a random spot, but is not updating the HTML yet. That means that when we play over here and I click somewhere, something's broken. So I'm going to look at my console and I've got an unexpected token on line 57. Those line numbers are super helpful. So I come over to 57. I'll come to you in 1 second. And it's all the way down here. Normally, when I have a curly missing, it's because I missed a curly brace somewhere higher up. So let's do a little tracing. I've got my opening curly, my closing curly, opening, closing, opening, closing, opening and closing. And what is this one for? That's my button on click. So
You
I
don't-
think I've got an extra one there.
Huh.
So now I come back over. I've gotten rid of my error message here. When I make a move, I can look here and see the computer picked a random spot. Now we need to test this a step further. We need to make sure that every time the computer plays, it is not overwriting a spot that I have played in. So I click on another spot here and I take a look, and so far so good. And I pick another spot and it continues to pick a random spot that is not its own spot and is also not one of our spots. So I'm going to pause there. Alba, did I answer your question?
I had the same question about the curly brace in the bottom that was red, but mine didn't go away.
Okay, share your screen. And I'm going to put up a poll as well, give you guys a minute to catch up. Unexpected online. Okay. Your extra one is on 54. And that should fix it for you.
Thank you.
No problem. You guys are working on that. One more review here. We generate a random number. We enter into this for loop that's going to run 1,000 times. We check to see if the random spot that we got was empty. If it is empty, we're done running the loop because we found what we're looking for, which is an empty spot. If we don't find that random number that got generated was empty, we come down to this else statement and say generate 2 new random numbers. So the next time we run this loop, we can
Share
check
your
to
screen,
see.
Max.
We can check to see if this random number we generated is empty. If this is empty, we've accomplished our goal. So this loop may only run one time. We may generate out these random numbers, find an empty spot, and be good to go. Or we could have to check 3, 4, all the way up to 1,000 times to find an empty spot. And as soon as we find that empty spot, we know we can break out of the array and say we can break out of the loop and say we found a random spot, we're good to go. So we come down here, we just check one final time to make sure that spot is empty. If it's not, something went wrong somewhere, we're going to let the user know that. Otherwise, we're going to take the random row and the random column either from here or from the last time we generated random numbers here, and then we're going to put the O into that spot on the board. And Zona, go ahead.
I'm still getting that error message. Give me 1 second and I can share.
Sure.
Okay.
You are not sharing yet. Ah, there it is.
I was trying to catch up with the code because I had some missing pieces.
So you're missing the closing curly after 49, between 49 and 50.
Okay, so another one right here.
Yeah,
Okay, perfect.
and that should fix you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
No problem. Looks like most of you have voted in. Do you have any questions before we move forward here? Remember, this is less about getting our code to work and more about making sure we understand why we wrote the code the way we did. understanding what the computer is doing when it's executing that code. So for the sake of documentation, I'm going to go over to our outline, and I'm going to add a step that says, have the computer
And I-
generate.
Sorry.
Thank you. Have the computer generate a random spot to play if the spot is taken, then keep checking random spots until it finds a place to play. Then put an O at that spot. Alba, go ahead.
Did you share day 2 on the outline?
Yeah, it should be published, but I did it right before class. So if you refresh, it should show up.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So we're doing good here. We've got our board and it's looking good in the console. What would be the next step?
Gotta update the board itself on the page.
Yes, we do. So what we're going to do is we're going to say update the HTML based off the board array in JavaScript. Okay, so we could keep adding code down here, but this is starting to get a little messy, right? We've got one giant function here. Maybe we want to break this up a little bit. So I'm going to come up to the top and I'm going to say const update HTML equal to a new arrow function. And I'm going to say, hey, I need to generate out based off of what is in this board our HTML over here that's going to set all the values of our buttons. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say for let row of board. Okay, what is that doing? That is getting each row array right here. So this is going to run 3 times, and it's going to give us access to each one of those things in the array. Then we need to get access to each individual space. So what we're going to do is we're going to say for let col of row, and then we have access to each individual thing here. So just like movie seats, we need some placeholder of when we're going to generate out our HTML. Where do we put all of that? So I'm going to say let HTML to update equal an empty string. And I'm going to say every time we hit a new row, add on a div. Okay, how do we know where that div is coming from? That div is coming right here. Then we say every time that we're done generating out a row, well, where does that go? This is handling all of the columns, but this is the end of our row loop. So what we can do is we know that the end of the row is going to get updated right before this closing curly brace. I can get the order right. There we go. So I'm going to close out my div there. That is this closing div. Okay, now I've got my buttons in here. I need to do that for each space. That is happening in this for loop in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to say HTML to update plus equals. And we are going to add in our, I'm going to do this as a template literal, and you'll see why in a second. Template literal just means I'm using backticks instead of using single or double quotes. So I'm going to add on my button, and I'm going to close out my button. But we run into an issue here. We've got all of these IDs in here. And we need those IDs to be in there because we need to know where we put the X of where they're clicking. So we run into an issue. I can't just say ID equals B1 here because every time this loop runs, we need to increment that, right? When the second button comes in, it needs to say it is B2. What if we come up and we say, let button counter equal 1. And we are going to, instead of putting in B1 as the ID, we're going to put in our button counter. And then every time we make a new button, we are going to add 1 to the button counter.
We have to stop it at some point.
But that stopping is going to be handled by our for loops here, because our for loops are only going to run over this array. Because the array is an empty board, the loops will only run 9 times total.
Okay. You're supposed to have a B before the $sign.
Yes, because we have a B before the number here.
Okay. I was thinking it was left over. Thanks.
No, it's a good catch. But
I
that
have a
one is
question.
intentional. Yep.
So each time you do the plus, okay, so if I was gonna do, say, button counter through 9, for example, maybe, would you keep doing it 9 times?
What do you mean for 9?
You said for 2, so you have the 1 button counter equals 1, and then you have the plus and the semicolon at the bottom. You said that's 2.
So it will
But that's
increment.
consecutive.
It will go through all 9 buttons.
Okay.
So basically what we're doing is we're saying, hey, this for loop is giving us access to this whole array. Then from that whole array, which is in row, take that row and loop over each column. Each column is right here. So
Right
the
there.
first
Okay,
time
each
this
column.
for loop runs, it's going to be that empty string.
Okay.
Then the next time this for loop runs, it's going to be this empty string and button counter will be 2. Then
Okay.
this runs a third time, gets us that empty string, button counter is now 3.
So does it go from 3 directly down to start 4 and then go from right to left, or it goes left to right again?
It will go left to right again.
Okay.
So this for loop is done being run. It's going to add in our closing div. It's going to go back up to this outer for loop, and row is now going to become this array up here. So it comes in, and now row, because it's this array, is going to come back in, generate a new div out, and then go through 4, 5, and 6. Now we
Gotcha.
know button counter is not going to reset because we put it outside both of our for loops. So because it's outside the for loops, this won't reset until we get to the end. So to
Okay.
test all of this out, I can console.log my button counter. I go back over to my browser and nothing's here. And if I click on something, nothing is still there. What do we need to do here?
You have to prompt the computer to move after the player does.
We need to tell it, hey, after you do all of your work, we need to update the HTML. So I come over here, I click on a spot, I get 10 coming out. Okay, well, why are we getting 10 coming out? Because we started at 1. This button counter is going to increment to 10, but 10 is never going to actually get used. So we've got our button counter working. We've got all of our HTML to update. What is the step that you missed?
Yeah, update inner HTML.
We did all of this work to generate this HTML to update, but we never used it, right? That's just a string. That isn't actually going into our code yet. So what we need to do is we need to say document, get element by ID. We're going to get that board, right? Our board right here. And what are we going to put inside of it? The inner HTML is going to be the HTML to update right here. So I come over here, I refresh my page, everything's cleared out. I make my first move and ooh no, that isn't what we wanted to happen. Okay. We've got our NBSP over here. Maybe that has something to do with it. So let me put my NBSP in over here. I save, I come over, I click on something. Okay.
Does it
Shifted-
maybe does it reset the styles? Like because the style was hard coded into the HTML. Is it maybe for ignoring that?
So we do have our, I'm not actually sure why the gap between them is disappearing. Let me just take a quick peek into the inspect. And our buttons do appear to be getting generated properly. We can see the NBSP in there. So I'm actually not sure why the gap is disappearing when we click on one of them. But let's save that problem for another minute. What is the other problem that we're seeing? When we click on something, what's happening?
Not updating with the proper shape.
It should be showing me my X, right? Well, we did all of that work. We said button inner HTML is equal to X. Why isn't that working?
Does it have to be defined within that code that we were doing?
What we did is we updated the inner HTML. We stored all of the information into the board. Then we came down to this update HTML and said, screw whatever is currently in there, overwrite it with this HTML that we just updated. Well, that HTML we just updated, we just put a space in each one of them. Well, that's not helpful. We need to show what the move is there. So what we're going to do is we're going to use another template literal. And what we want to show there is the value of the call coming from the for loop. So we come over here, I make a move, and now, okay, that's progress. My X is showing up. Nothing else is showing up, but my X is there. Okay, let's fix this problem. We know that if we put an NBSP in it, it fixes the issue, right? I think the other way we could fix it is by using a min height on it. Ew. I do not like that solution. Okay, let's fix it another way. We can say if there is a column value that is equal to X, or there is a column value equal to O, then update our HTML with that value. Else, make the value NBSP. So I come over here, I click on my X, and I get my X showing up. So I'm going to pause there, give you guys a minute. What we did here, give you a recap. We realized that, hey, we're doing all of this board work and we're putting in a spot for the computer to go. We're getting our board set, but when we once all of the data is updated in our JavaScript array, we call this function called update HTML. Update HTML comes up to this function up here. It creates an empty string, and it starts button counter out at 1, because we need to know what button number we're on when we're generating out that HTML. Then we loop over the board, which means it's going over each one of these arrays here and storing it in row. For every row, we want there to be a new div that shows up like that div. Then we say we need to loop over the row to get out each individual column, each individual space that they're playing in. Once we do that, we come in here and we check to see if the column has an X or an O in it. If it does, we use the button counter, which is going to start out as 1 and increment every time we go through a different space. And we put the value of the column in there. And we're using this template literal syntax, the $ curly brace, which we can do because we use the backtick right here. So if the space is taken, if it is an X or an O, then put in the value of the column. If it is not an X or O, it must be an empty space, so put in the NBSP instead. Pausing there, starting a poll, letting you guys catch up. As always, if you have any questions, even if you're not coding along, now's the time to ask.
Max, incidentally, I think I know why those spaces are collapsing between your buttons. Because in your original HTML, each button element is on its own line. And then in the generated HTML, they're all up next to each other. I think when you make a line in the HTML, it adds a tiny space.
Really?
I think so.
Learn something new every day. I did not realize that it would be adding that space. So the trick here, I don't really like this solution, but it does fix the problem. We add a line break, a line return, click at the end of this line and hit enter. That moves this backtick down onto its own line, which prevents the shift in our board from happening. And that's because every button, thanks to Doug sleuthing here, is on a separate line here. But when we were generating it out over here, we weren't putting each one on its own line. We were smushing them all together. So by adding in that line break there, it spaces it out properly. Thank you, Doug.
You got it. Artrell has a question.
Go for it.
For some reason, I'm having a hard time understanding the concept of the button counter. I guess I'm trying to figure out why we need it.
Yep. So over here, we have B1, B2, B3, right? And then we got B4, B5, B6.
Right.
We're using that button counter. So down here, we know based off of what button they click on, we know what indexes to use in the array to set the proper value, right?
Right.
So up here, this button, either this line of code or this line of code is going to run every time we go over a spot in the board. So the first time, the first button we need to generate, this button right here, we look at this and we say there's not an X or an O in that space. So we're going to use this HTML down here. So we go in here, but we still need to keep track of what button number they are clicking on. So we can't just say B1 in here because this loop is going to run 9 times. So basically what we need to do is say start the counter at 1. And every time that you make a new button, add 1 to the button counter. That means the next time this for loop runs and we get to this second button here, what it's going to do is take the B and add in the number 2.
So it helps it keep track.
This is the computer keeping track of how many buttons it has put out. So our ID is generated with the right number on it. Hey, I'm generating the 6th button. That means that button should have an ID of B6.
Okay. It makes more sense now.
I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah, and sometimes it's helpful if we click in a space, we can actually go into inspect, go into our div, and see what's getting generated out by our updated HTML. Right, so we can actually see here, and we can play with this, right? If we wanted to say, instead of a space showing up, we want an E to show up instead, to show that it's empty. I don't know, or maybe a dash. A dash might be a better option. So if we go look in our code now, and I click on a spot, you notice all those dashes show up. Well, that makes sense. We said if the space is empty, make a dash show up. But if we actually look in our inspect and go into the div, we can see that HTML that we generated out being shown in the browser. So this entire div is basically whatever the HTML to update equals. That HTML to update is a div for every row, and then a button for every space or every column. And then we put in our closing div, take that out once we have gone over all of the rows, which is our closing curly brace there, and then add that into the inner HTML. Exona, do you have a code issue?
Yeah, it's not working. I don't know
Go
what's
ahead,
going
share your screen. So mine is not fully functional either, but it should work on the first move that you take.
I think
Oh, you have a single quote on line 25 that should be a backtick instead, and same on 27.
how to do a backtick.
Under the escape key,
Oh,
no shift, yeah. And then you
gotcha.
also need it at the end of the string before, yeah, you got it. And then same thing on 27, yeah.
Okay. I was like, I don't know how to do that. Okay. Oh, come on. 36.
Okay, you've got button counter in there. You can just take that whole line out.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yep. Have any other questions before we move on here?
Trying to fix something first. See if I can make it work. So it tells me that the computer can't make a move. Something went wrong. But I'm not
Okay.
getting error messages.
Share your screen, let's take a look. Unless you have every spot filled in the board, it should not be doing that.
Yeah.
So a good place to start is at the where that error message is. So it's going to be all the way down.
See, I didn't see a message in the console.
You've got a single equal there instead of a triple equal.
What line are we talking about?
72.
Your 72 or my 72? They're different.
Your 72, my 69.
Okay, thanks. So it should have been a double.
It's actually should be a exclamation point not
Ah.
equal.
Yeah.
And then that should be an empty string, not a 0.
Where, okay.
And I think that should get you caught up.
Nope.
Mm,
Let me reload.
So let me request remote control here. Your indentation being off is really making it hard, because what's happening here is we don't know, oops, when does this if run? Does it run as part of this for loop? Is it part of this if statement? Right? We don't really know. This is the end of the for loop, which means this should be down on its own line. So now we can say, okay, we're trying to go through the whole board. We are checking to see if we find an empty space, then we're breaking out of the loop if we do. Then we go to the board and we say, check the random row and the random column to see if it's not empty. And if it isn't empty, that means we didn't find an empty spot and something went wrong there. So if I go up, that's fine. Random number between is fine. We do our on click. We do random number. We say I run it less than 1,000. We check to see if it is empty. If it is, we break. If it isn't, we generate a new random number. You've got a semicolon right here. Give that
Okay.
a try, see if that fixes it.
Yeah, I had such a hard time looking at all of that because I thought it was going to be an issue like that. So let's see. I can fill every single box except for the top right. Oh, that's not right. And then I get to 2 other empty boxes and the computer can't make a move.
Okay, so if you can you make a move and have the X show up?
I can.
Okay, so that's where we're at right now. Is just getting that code working. You are missing, however, let me just take a look. You've got your update HTML. We need to add that in down here.
Okay.
So all that work that you did wasn't actually running until we call the function or execute the function right there.
Oh, goodness. All right. That was a lot to keep up with. Thank you.
Yep.
Let's see.
Any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, I'm just going to hang out during break.
Okay, so we've got our update HTML over here. Let me take that dash out before I forget, because we don't actually want it to be doing that. Okay, so I click, I make my move. This is supposed to be an NBSP, sorry. Put that back to the way it should be. I click, I make my move. Well, where's my computer move? We did all of this work down here to say, find the random spot, check to make sure the spot isn't isn't taken already. Check down here one final time to make sure that it's actually empty, then go update the HTML. Well, the update HTML is checking to see if it's an X or an O, and then it's going to put in that value. Why is our computer O not showing up?
Do we need a console log?
We can try a console log. So let me do a console.log my board here. Let's see what's going on. So I'm over here. I go to my console. I click. Okay, I'm looking at line 72, right? I go in 72, and I've got my O in there. Actually, that is a little deceiving. So you see this little sneaky eye over here? If we hover over that, it says this value was evaluated upon first expanding. It may have changed since then. That array is showing us the value when we click on the arrow. It's not showing us the value when we actually do the console log. What's happening is our O doesn't get set in until after we run the update HTML. We need to take this O and set it in before we update the HTML. So if I save that, come over here and move, boom, we get our O in there. And if we keep going, while I'm clicking, nothing's happening. Okay, maybe it's the fluke. I refresh, I make a move, the computer moves. Okay, everything's going great. I click somewhere, doesn't work. All right, one step forward, two steps back. What's going on here? How could we start to debug this?
Okay, for any errors in the console, or
No errors in the console.
I mean, yeah.
That's a good first step. Yep. We would check that. What else can we debug with?
Would you use a while loop or a loop just to continue?
While we don't need, but let's break it down. When we click on a button, something is not happening, right? We just want to make sure that our on click is working. So I'm going to come down and I'm going to find wherever my on click is, and right at the top of it, before it does anything, I'm just going to add a console log clicked. So I come back over here, I refresh it all out, I click on my first button, and I get my clicked. Okay, good. Now I come up here and I click on another button. Where's my clicked? Okay, click on another button. None of my buttons are clicking all of a sudden.
We have to add.
But I've got my on click here. I said for all my buttons. Why do we have to add the on click back?
Or for every time it's clicked.
What happened up here, we remade all of our buttons. So when we updated our HTML, all buttons, the on click on those old buttons got wiped out. So now our on click on all the new buttons we've generated are no longer working. That on click was on the old buttons. When we overwrote the inner HTML, that on click was now no longer there. So we have two options rolling forward here. We could either, at the end of this, once we update all the HTML, we could move this into a function and say, hey, go add the on click back to all the new buttons now. Or we could add our on click directly to the button. We could say on click, and we could say button clicked and get the event. but we don't have anything called button clicked. If I go over to the browser and click on something, I get my clicked, but if I click on something else, I get button clicked is not defined. Well, of course it's not defined. What I want to happen every time the button click is all of this stuff down here. So why don't we say, hey, instead of getting all of the buttons, I'm going to just comment that out. And I'm going to comment out my for loop, and I'm going to go all the way down and comment out that last curly brace. And then I'm going to say, instead of doing my button on click, which was coming from my for loop, I'm going to say const button clicked is equal to this function. Now I come over here. Nothing's happening, not yet at least, because the first time our page loads, it's still using all of the HTML over here. That HTML doesn't have an on-click on it, but we already wrote this really nice function that's handling all of the on-click stuff for us. So instead of using all this HTML over here, we can actually delete out everything from over here, and then come over here and say, when the page first loads, just update the HTML. So I come over here, page first loads, I click on it, and I get button is not defined on line 40. You can actually get rid of that whole line. Try that again. So I click on something, and I get my X and I get my O. And I click somewhere else, and I get my X and I get my O. And if I click on a space that's already taken, nothing happens. I can click on something else, and I get my X and I get my O. Okay, there's a lot. We're going to stop and poll. But before you answer in the poll, I'm going to do a summary of all of this. So if you got it working, you can vote. If not, I'm going to go through what we just did there. Initially, what we did is we said, hey, go get all the elements by the tag button. Then we had this for loop here that was looping over each one of them and adding the on-click event to the button itself. The problem that we were running into, however, is that when we updated our HTML based off of all the values in the board, we were making new buttons. Those new buttons didn't have the on-click event that we added when the page first loaded. So instead, what we did is we said, hey, when we're updating all the HTML, if that space is not taken with an X or an O, add an on-click to that called button clicked. Then we bypassed our for loop that was going over each one of the buttons and instead made a function called button clicked. This is now our on-click event. Our button clicked is only going to run when a button is clicked on. However, we're doing all of this work here to generate out the HTML. So we need that HTML to get generated the first time the page loads. In order to accomplish that, all we need to do is call update HTML. Now, all of this inner HTML is going to get generated the first time the page loads, so we actually don't need anything over here. We're updating all the HTML the first time the page loads. That means that we come in here, we go over our array, our board, and we generate out the HTML like we were before. Now the only difference is we added that on-click event. The browser detects that that is button clicked, and when the browser sees that on-click happening, it comes down here and now runs this function called button clicked. So instead of us reaching in from our JavaScript into our HTML and attaching the button clicked, instead, we're going in reverse. We're saying every time we generate out a button, add this event called button clicked on it. And when that happens, go ahead and run the function called button clicked.
So like last project with the movie seats, we did not something similar, but like when it comes to just removing all the all the HTML we did, that part always gets me tripped up because like the refactoring in general kind of confuses me because I'm like, well, if we could have just not done it in the first place, you know, it just gets me a little confused.
It is nearly impossible to write code without having to do a refactor at some point. The reasoning behind that is when we're going out and doing this, we didn't think about regenerating all the buttons, right? We just said, okay, well, all the buttons are here. Let's add an on click to all of that. And then we went along and we did a little bit more and we generated out our buttons, and all of a sudden our on click breaks. And we're like, well, that was all working and it works the first button I click on. What's the problem there? And so the reason why we go through that step, even though I knew this would be a problem when we wrote that initial code, is to show you guys, hey, we can't always get it perfect the first time because it was doing everything that we wanted, right? But when we added in the functionality to generate out all the buttons, we broke our on click. That was one step forward. Hey, our data from the array is showing up, but 2 steps back because our on click suddenly broke. So that's when we need to go back in and say, okay, how can we make it so even on these new generated buttons, the on click will still be there? So the refactoring we had to do is kind of necessary at that point, right? We may not know that our on click is suddenly going to break until we got later into the project. Now that we are later into the project, we can say, hey, this update HTML, that is the main thing that's going to generate out my HTML. When the page first loads, use the array to generate out all of my buttons. Now that my JavaScript is making my HTML, I don't need to worry about having anything over here because this is essentially an algorithm that's going to convert the data in this board array into HTML buttons that are making my user interface. So when we come over here and we look at the page source, there's nothing in here. It just says div ID board. It looks just like our div here. However, after the JavaScript runs, we can go into our elements and look at our board. And there's a div in here. And we open that div and we see our div ID B1, B2, B3. We're like, well, where did that come from? That came from this for loop, this algorithm essentially that is generating out the divs and the buttons.
And it knows what number was. That's further at the bottom, isn't it? No, I don't know.
It knows what button it is because we're incrementing button counter here.
Oh, there it is. Okay.
Do we want a top-down review of this, where we start at the top and just work our way down? or do you want a review of how the computer executes all of this?
Both?
Okay, let's start with the order the computer executes all of this. So we're here. Browser says, hey, some HTML. I gotta remember that when I show a button, it's gotta be a certain width. I come down here, I've got an empty div. I'm like, okay, whatever. Div ID board. I'll remember that there's a div, an empty div called board. And oh, there's some JavaScript here that I've got to run. Okay, let me go figure out what that JavaScript is going to be, because otherwise this is going to show up as a completely blank page. There's nothing in that div, so nothing shows up. So we come over to our JavaScript. We ignore this line, right? Because that was part of the refactoring, and it's commented out. And we say, okay, we're going to store a board. That board is one array made up of 3 sub-arrays, and those sub-arrays have 3 empty strings in them. I don't need to do anything with that yet. I'm just going to remember that data structure. I'm going to save that in my memory, so when the user tells me to work on board, I know what to do. Then it comes down here and says random number between. And it goes, okay, this is a function that is going to take 2 parameters. I don't really need to care about this yet because I'm not being told to run it. I'm just being told how to run it when I am actually asked to do that. Then I come down here and I get my update HTML and I go, this is another function. I don't really need to care about this until I get told, go run update HTML. So I skip over all of this code in here and I get down to my update HTML and I'm like, oh crap. Now I actually have to do the code that's inside this function. So we start by creating an empty string. Our empty string is where our HTML is going to get stored, right? That is just our running place we can shove things we are making in our HTML. We could call that string anything. It's just another string. But HTML to update is a descriptive variable name, right? We're saying, hey, this is where we're storing all the HTML as we're generating it out. Then we come down here and we've got our button counter equal to 1. Okay, we don't know why we need a button counter yet, but we know it's going to start out at the number 1. So we come into this for loop. And our for loop here is saying, okay, go over the board. So we get board up here, and it says every time you go over something in that board, for every time there is something of that board, put it into the row. So this, we know, is going to run 3 times with the 3 different arrays up here for that row. Now we come down here and we go, hey, every time we make a new row, we're going to put all of that stuff in a div. And anytime we're done processing that row, we're also going to put in the closing div. And we know that's going to happen at the beginning and end of every row because it's the first line after the curly brace, and it is the last line right before the last curly brace. All of that is telling us that that div will show up 3 times because we have 3 rows. Okay, now we come in here and we say, of that row, give us each column. That is going to be these empty spaces in here. So it says, hey, is that empty space an X or an O? If it is, we want to add in a button and we want to use the ID B1. How do we know that's B1? Because anything between the $ and the curly braces is going to take whatever the value is up here because we're using those backticks. So this says, okay, button ID B, hold up, template literal, what's the value of button counter? Oh, it's 1. This is going to be B1. Okay, now it comes in, it goes, okay, oh, hold up again, $ curly braces. What is the value of col? Call is coming in from our loop up here, which means it's going to be whatever value is in that column, in that array. We drop that value in between the buttons. So we're going to show whatever the value is in our HTML to the end user. Then we close out the button tag. However, if it is not an X or an O, it's an open spot. It hasn't been taken yet. So we're going to add the button, and we add this thing called onClick. Now, the onClick we don't care about yet because no one's clicked on this yet. So we come in here, we add in the ID with our button counter like we did before, and we say put in an NBSP in there. In other words, just put in a space because that is an empty spot to play. Then close out the button tag. It comes back over here. We add 1 to the button counter because we need to keep track of what number button are we on. Then it comes down, it hits this curly brace, comes back up and says, hey, is there another column in this row? That would be this one right here. There is. We check to see if it's an X or an O. When the game first starts, there are no plays in there. So we come down, we hit this HTML to update. We add in our B2 this time because we incremented the button number last time the loop ran. We come down here, we add 1 to the button counter. We get the third column generated out. And then we say, hey, there are no more columns in this row. So add in our closing div tag, come back up, and repeat that process 2 more times for our other 2 rows. All of this is generating out the HTML that you see when you go into your inspect elements. That HTML is all getting stored in this variable called HTML to update. Then we are using the DOM to grab the div board, take our HTML to update, and make it show up inside the div ID board. That means that we can see all the HTML it's generating in our elements. With all of that said, there's one more piece of our code, and that is, of course, the button clicked. So when the page first loads, it says button clicked is another function. There's nothing else at the end of this file, so I'm done for now. It doesn't run button clicked. All it does is it runs these for loops 9 times in total. It takes our HTML that we built based off of the array, shows that up in the browser, and we are finished and good to go. Then the user clicks on one of these buttons. And what the browser does is it looks at the code and it says, oh, B3, that has an onClick function called button clicked. Where did this button clicked came from? It came from our onClick right here. So when the button is clicked on, the HTML goes back to our JavaScript and looks for a function called button clicked. Based off of what button was clicked on using the ID, we use the proper index to add an X to that spot in our multi-dimensional array. From there, the player just went, so we need, as a computer, we need to find a spot that is empty and play there. So we generate out a random spot to get started with, and we go into this for loop that's going to run 1,000 times unless it finds a spot that is empty first. So it checks to see if the spot that we generated out right here using the random row 0, 1, or 2 and the random col 0, 1, or 2 to see if that spot is empty in the array. If it is empty in the array, great. We found where we want to go and we want to put the O in there. If it is not empty, we want to come down here, generate out a new random number, and have this for loop run again to check to see if the new spot is now empty. Once we find an empty spot, we break the loop. So this loop may run 1 time and say, hey, first try, you found an empty spot. Or it may run 1,000 times and say, hey, for whatever reason, we couldn't find an empty spot. We tried 1,000 different combinations in your 3x3 grid, and we couldn't find something that was empty. So we come down here, and that's what this if statement is doing. It's saying no matter how many times this for loop runs, because we are outside the curly brace of that for loop, check to see if whatever random row and col we picked is empty. If it's not empty, something went wrong, the computer doesn't know where to play. Go ahead and tell the user that. Otherwise, come down here and put an O in the random row and col that we found as empty. But we're not done yet. This is just updating our that is just updating our JavaScript array. Our HTML needs to go back over that array to update all of the information in our HTML. So we come down to this update HTML and we go, wait a second, we know that function. That function got run when the page first loaded. So we go back up to the top and we realize, hey, these for loops are going to run just like they ran last time. But now we have a column with an X in it because we set that right here. And we've got a column with an O in it because we set that right here. That means that when we generate out all of our buttons again, instead of getting the button that has the on click on it, instead we're going to hit this conditional and get this button, which is going to show us the value of the column from the board array.
I lost you there.
So just like button counter is going to show 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Mhm.
The column is going to show us whatever the value is up here. So basically what happens here is our row is equal to that whole array.
Mhm.
That passes down into our row, which gets us the column. That column is going to give us each individual value here, here, and here. When we update our array to store the X or the O, we're storing that in a specific index. That means if I click on the center spot, an X is going to show up in that array. We are then looping over that array twice, one for the rows and then next for the columns. And whatever the value is in that spot, it's going to show it right here. So if we look at our, I'm going to throw a console.log board in here. If I click on that center spot and I look at my console, I can see, hey, I put that in on line 15. So let me look at line 15 here. It's an array of arrays. This X and this O are in there. That makes sense. I clicked on this one. The computer randomly generated a spot and took this one. So this array would look like this. In fact, we can even save that, and when we refresh, the game would actually start there. So what we're doing is we're taking the values of this array and we're dropping it in to what's between the button. That is the text that's going to show up. So because there is an X here, if we inspect and look at that button, we can see there is an X. That X is showing up because we are putting in the value of the array that we're looping over up here. So in other words, if we have that X in here, what's happening is it's trickling down from the row down to the row right here. That row is trickling into the column. That column is getting this value only, and that X is going through this column to this column over here. So that means everything between these $ curly braces is going to equal out to the X from the array. That gives us the row. The row trickles down to our column. We go to our column. Our column is going up and grabbing this one value. That one value is going back into our column, and the column is going over to our template literal.
So is that where the selection is stored?
The selection is stored in the board, and then we generate the HTML every time a new selection is made. But we store the selection right here, and then we store the user or the computer selection right here. Once those two are selected, this board array is updated with both selections, so that when we loop over both of them, we are able to get the selection in the column and add it in to the button value. We go on break and give everyone a minute to let this sink in. We're actually going to give you 25 minutes to let all of this sink in. Then when we come back, we are going to break out in groups or a solo exercise. It's up to you guys. I can put you guys in a breakout room if you would like. You're going to do two things. The one thing is you are going to make it so the computer can detect if there is a winner. So you're going to be using if statements and your board array to check to see if there is a winner. And if there is a winner, you are going to alert the winner that they have won. And that should go if the computer wins or if the user wins. That's the main assignment. However, you would like to push yourselves. You could also make the computer play smarter. In other words, block the user from winning if they have 2 in a row. That's the extra credit assignment. That might be one you want to save to the weekend. But what you guys want to focus on is, how do I write some code using all the JavaScript we have so far to say, hey, once the user has gone, check to see if the user won. If the user did win, then let them know they won. Otherwise, have the computer go and check to see if the computer won. And if the computer won, let them know.
Hey, Max.
Yes.
Sorry for being late. So I went ahead and asked in advance. Right now, we're in what's known as blackout for the Black Friday, Cyber Monday. So Tuesday of next week is the last Tuesday that I won't be able to go in early and get out early. So that's the only other class I'm going to be late to.
No problem. Thank you for the heads up.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we're going to take a break. We'll be back at 7:30, and then we can break out if you guys want to work on trying to get the computer, the game winner checker to work. See you guys at 7:30. any sections of the code that we would like to re-review before we break out and have you guys attempt the game checking code? Okay, so I'm going to give everyone just a little starting point here, and then I'll open up breakout rooms if you guys want to go into groups. So what we're going to do is we're going to come down here and we're going to say after the X has been placed, but before the computer goes, call a function here that checks to see if the player won. If the player won, alert them, else make the computer move. And then we're going to come down here and say, check to see if computer won. If so, alert. So to get you started, we're going to need two functions. So I'm going to go up to here and I'm going to say const check for player win. And I'm going to do a const check for computer win. You guys are going to be using these functions down where I left comments down here. So the ultimate goal here is let me see if I can pull up my code. Ignore the styling here. The idea here is that if I click, X is what? So 3 in a row, right? And we can also check that going across, maybe. The computer stops blocking me. Okay, the computer's getting really lucky here. It should, if you get 3 in a row across, also show you that as well. You get the idea. You know how to play tic-tac-toe. So let me open up the breakout rooms. If you guys would like to work in a small group, you are welcome to go into a room. If you are going to attempt it on your own, I will be here as well. So if you want me to join your room, I can do that. Otherwise, if you have any questions or just want to review the code to see if you're on the right track, you can do that as well. I'm going to paste this code into Slack. So you have it, and then I will be on standby for the next 30 minutes or so to see if you guys need any help.
Max, if I do join another group, can I just stay with you just to go over the code?
Sure.
one more-
You want me to do a run through from top to bottom?
Yeah, I want to know if if I understand it and if my comments are correct.
Sure. Go ahead, share your screen. Let's take a look.
I kind of want to do that in private. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go to room 5.
Okay. Where are the rooms?
I just opened them.
Okay.
If anyone else wants to break off and needs individual help, I'm here and happy to go into a room. Or if you just have any questions as you're working, I'm right here.
I might need some help, Doug.
All right. You want to go in a room?
Yeah.
Let's go to room 4.
How we doing in here? Does anyone have questions or want to screen share through their progress so far?
Yes, hi.
Hello.
Turn off. Ooh, sorry, I should have done that before.
No problem. It was a short
Actually,
enough clip that it won't be a copyright issue.
Okay, thanks.
I think I might have it, Max.
Okay. Do you mind, Jennifer, if Brian goes first?
Go for it, because I'm not at the same place.
Okay.
I don't want to. It might be Jennifer. It might be better for you. Did you want to work through it?
Well, let me hear what you've got.
The
My-
interesting thing with any assignment like this is that there are probably 4 or 5 different ways of solving it. And
Mhm.
just because you solved it one way, Brian, doesn't mean that it's the better or best way of solving it. It just means that you got it working using that code, right? So this type of problem, there are only a couple different ways of doing it, but I like to prefix that as preface? Anyway, preface. Thank you. I'm just
Yeah.
like,
That's it. Yeah.
Well, no,
because
go ahead.
everyone solves it a little differently.
Yeah, no, I haven't been able to work on that part yet, so go ahead. I scheduled with you already, Max, so if I don't get to it here, it's okay.
I had my calendar open on my other monitor, and I literally saw like your event just like pop in, and I was like, oh.
Mhm. Yeah.
All right, Brian, go for it.
All right. So let me share the screen. Oh, give me one sec. Okay. See my script. Okay. How do I move this bar? Do I just drag it? Okay. Yeah, nice. All right. So basically I went with what probably is a very clunky approach. Like, since it's a 3x3 grid, there's not a ton of combinations that would be winning.
Yep.
All right. So starting with the check for player win.
Yep.
All right. I literally just went through, said if the board at position 0, 0, 0, 1, and 0, 2 are all X, then that means the player won. Same thing going down. 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2.
Yep.
Then that means the player won. Literally, it's very simple logic. I think pretty much anybody can figure it out from that point. And I just went down pretty much all the combinations that would be a win. I made sure those were grouped together, and I alert the player win. If that combination doesn't, then I try the next one, all the way down to
76 there.
what was that? Oh, alert. Yes. Okay. Good catch. And I wasn't quite sure how to end it if like none of the combinations work, so I just did a return, but I could see where that might mess some things up. And so as far as for the computer win, I literally just copied and pasted what I did up there because the logic applies the same. You'll see I definitely copied and pasted because the zero's still in there. But basically it's the same thing. I just went through and all the logic, I made it to check for the O instead.
Yep.
And again, alert computer one, return. And then I plugged them in where you told us to.
Yep.
By the time you came back, I had just did check for player win, and it worked. And so I'm gonna plug in. It's probably I could just pull it up.
So for your else return, I would just leave that off. By default, if a function doesn't return anything, it returns null by default. But it is somewhat common to have functions that don't return anything. So you can just leave that whole thing off. It will do the exact same thing, but it's just not common to have like an else case with the return because it will automatically just hit that and return null if none of those things are true.
Okay, so just like that is fine.
I would even take out the else and just leave it with all the else ifs above it.
Okay. Like that.
Yep. If you needed to, you could return something that said like return true if the player did win, and then you could do some conditional based off of where you call the function. But
Okay.
for the assignment that I gave you, this is the right approach to doing it.
Okay. All right. And yeah, I tried it in the browser real quick, so I'll see if let me see. All right.
The only thing that
refresh.
I don't like is seeing the word function instead of an arrow function.
Where do you see that?
On 86, you made a function using the old school way of doing it instead of
Oh,
doing
okay.
a const with the equal arrow.
Okay. Got you. And I did that for I
You
did that on the
that the
top one.
better way that way,
On the
yes.
top. Okay. All right.
Which is that is a nitpick, right? Like to the computer, it isn't really different, but
yeah. No, it's weird because I normally do like I naturally write functions like that because most of my learning has been like with that there. So
sure.
I'm not quite sure why I did it that way. But can you see the browser right now?
No, it's just sharing your VS Code.
Oh, okay. How do I get my browser to show? I'm sorry, I'm so clunky with this.
Stop
You-
sharing.
I'll just,
Yep, stop share and then restart it.
okay.
Yeah, and then select the desktop or wherever you want.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's that one. All right.
Yep, you're good.
And okay. See if it works.
Beautiful.
So it pops up player one. It doesn't show the X though. I don't know if that's a nitpicky thing, but oh, there it is. Okay.
Yep.
All right.
So beautiful. From there, you have two options. You can either say, I want it when I hit OK for the board to clear out so that they can play again. So you would have to figure out how to set up your arrays to clear everything and then recall that update HTML. Or you could focus in and say, okay, how do I make the computer smarter and block me instead of picking a random spot to go?
Sounds good. We'll try that.
So that's the next challenges. I do have to hop into one of the breakout rooms, so I will be back in a couple minutes unless anyone has a quick question.
No.
I'm so sorry. I thought this was us like reconvening. I'm so sorry. I wouldn't have done that if I thought you were just popping in the check.
You're fine. No. That's what I'm here for. I will be right back in a couple minutes.
Jonah, why do you look defeated by code? Just not smiling.
It's like, you know what you have to do, but then like how?
Xona, you are muted. I don't know if you're talking to us.
Yes, I was the entire time. I have sciatica, so this is like sitting here is super uncomfortable, and I'm struggling with the code, so it's like cherry on top of a cherry. So that's why I look defeated by the code, Jordan. You are muted now.
I was muted when I was trying to tell you that you were muted, because whenever you like leave a breakout room, it automatically mutes you when you go into whatever other one. And so I was like, you're muted. And then it comes up on the screen and it's like, you are muted. And I'm like, son of a, we're all muted together.
All of us.
Welcome back, everyone. So I don't know. I know some of you guys were here for Brian showing his solution, but the general idea here is this is what engineering is all about, right? Breaking down something that we can say in English very easily into a way the computer can understand it, right? So Tic Tac Toe is a game we have all played, right? It is, we know the rules and we know how you win it. We, however, cannot just go to the computer and say if they have 3 in a row, they won the game. So we have to break that down a little bit more. How does the computer know where the user has played? That's all in that board array, right? And we know that we can use multiple indexes to store all that information. We already did that with all of the if statements, right? If the button is B1, then this is where to store it in the array. If it's B2, it's 0, 1 is where we're storing it, right? So what we're thinking through here is, hey, we not only need to tell the computer what a winning combination is, but we also need to tell it if that winning combination exists, tell the user they won. But there are multiple ways you can win, right? It could be all in the first column, all in the second column, all in the third column. So we need to write if statements for all of that. Then we need to say, well, it's not just about the columns, it's also about the rows. So we need to start thinking through that, right? And so that's what it comes down to. It's not pretty code. It's probably 50 lines of if statements. But what you're doing is you're telling the computer, check to see if this winning combination is there. And if it is, do something. Next, check to see if this winning combination is there. There is no 3 lines of code where Max just comes in and just writes, oh, if board equals 1, right? You've got to tell the computer what that win looks like. Does anyone have any questions on that before we switch over to the terms? Brandon, it looks like you have a question, but you don't know what the question is.
Oh, exactly. Well, the way I started to format it was I made an array of the winning combinations. But I guess yeah, I guess my question would have been from there, like organizing the if statement, if else statements.
That would be a more complicated solve for that. In fact, Doug, correct me if I'm wrong, but you actually wrote a for loop solution to check for wins instead of a long if else, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so Doug took on the challenge of saying, instead of writing out all the different winning combinations in an if statement, can we basically have the computer check in a loop to say, go across this row, and if all 3 of them are X's, then there is a win in there. And then, you know, do that for each of the rows and do it for each of the columns. So that is one alternative solution. The easiest solution is, let me write out if statements for all the winning combinations. The next level of that is saying, hey, let me take the approach that you took, Brandon, and say, this is what a winning board looks like. Let's compare this board to the existing board, and if they line up, the user has won. And then the third solution for that is saying, hey, instead of just checking all of these different winning scenarios, or instead of running through all of these arrays and comparing the two of them, what we're going to do is we're going to teach the computer how to check for a win. So we're actually going to say, we're going to write an algorithm using a for loop to say, check for 3 in a row across, or 3 in a row down, or 3 in a row diagonally. And as soon as you find something that is not the same thing over and over again, it's not a win, go on and move to the next thing to check to see if that is a win. That is the most complicated way of solving it that I can think of, but it is the most efficient in that we can write 5 or 6 lines of code and train the computer to check for that. The benefit of taking that approach is you could make tic-tac-toe with more than a 3x3 grid. So if you are saying, hey, I want to play tic-tac-toe with a 5x5 grid, now your check for win doesn't work because you've only written out for the 9 or the 3x3 grid, the 9 spots. So that is the benefit of the more complex solution with the for loop, is you can train the computer to say, hey, keep going all the way across this row, no matter how long the row is, to check to see if all of those winning spots are in there. And this is kind of what a coding interview is at a job interview, right? Of being able to explain your code out, say what the code is doing, and then be able to talk about it. And the interviewer will propose something and say, well, how could you write that code more efficiently? And you don't necessarily need to do it, but you want to talk through the strengths and the pros and the cons of your code, right? And that's something that comes with time. That's not something that I would expect a junior level developer to build tic-tac-toe right out of the gate. And that's something that I was actually talking to Exona about, was as a junior developer, you aren't expected to be able to do a project like tic-tac-toe from start to finish, right? As a junior developer, there is a team of senior developers that you'll be able to go to and lean on for mentorship. And that's a really hard thing, because as someone who just completed a course, you think like, oh, I got all of my training, I should know everything I need to know to do this job. And that's just not possible, right? As a junior developer, there is so much to learn. Even as a senior developer, there are things that I still rely on my team in order to do or do better, or something that I don't know. So it's really tough, because you've gone through this training and you're like, I should know everything I need to know, right? And it's like, yes, to get started, to get that first position, but you should not be expected as a junior developer to be able to complete an entire project from start to finish. Instead, you'll be given an existing project and say, hey, here's this task, but when you get stuck or when you have additional questions, here's who you can go to ask those questions up. And that's really where that imposter syndrome battle kicks in, of saying, okay, let me just break this down. Let me attempt this. And then I can go to my mentor and say, here's how I was trying to do this. Is this the way you would have done it? And that's when you start to learn and build that confidence so that you can do it on your own. With that said, if you would like to work on your solution, Brandon, of comparing a winning array to the board array, that would be a great one-on-one. So I can go through that with you and kind of think through. It would almost be like a reverse technical interview of me trying to think through on the spot, how do we accomplish that? How do we compare one array to another array and make sure that they are the same? Which is harder than it sounds. But that is the engineering mindset, right? Let me think like the user first. When a user clicks on a button on the board, what needs to happen? Okay, well, I need to run some JavaScript code when they click on that. So I'm not jumping from, hey, I need to make tic-tac-toe down to the on-click level. I'm breaking it down and saying, hey, the user's going to click on this. I need them to do something. So the engineer mind is saying, how do I get to the technical level of knowledge that I have from the English that I'm trying to make happen, right? Yes, I'm trying to build tic tac toe, but that is way too broad. Let me break that down another level. I need the board to show up. What do I need to do for that? Now the board is showing up. What's the next thing the user does? Well, it's going to be they click on something. And maybe I'm not familiar with on click. So I go back to my W3 schools. I go back to free code camp. I brush up on that. And then I say, okay, all I'm trying to do is make it so this code runs when they click on this one thing. Now that I got that working, what is the next level, breaking that task down? And then before you know it, you've built an entire tic-tac-toe game in 2 days of class.
Yeah, I feel that way would be helpful because I feel like I mean, I guess the way I tend to think through things, it's still kind of clashing with the way JavaScript runs. So yeah, I might make that one-on-one.
Sure. It's what those one-on-ones are for, right? And Doug will attest the one-on-ones are anything that you would like to make them, almost anything you would like to make them. So it is not just for saying like, hey, I'm falling behind, I need help. Those one-on-ones are whatever you make it, right? And that's what makes this program unique compared to other boot camps is that you guys can say like, I'm working on this side project, or I did week 4 homework and I got a 3 on it, but I'd really like to spend more time. I'm trying to accomplish this thing. Or I heard this term in the industry. I think I want to make a career out of it. Can you talk about that? Or those one-on-ones are really whatever you would like to make them. As long as you bring something to the table, we will find a way to make sure that you get, if not the answers, at least pointed in the right direction to get those answers. And that's what those one-on-ones are really for.
Yeah, I used to write down just questions throughout the week. I kept a file open on my computer. Anything that came up, I would jot it down, whether it was homework related or not. And I met with Max. By the end, I met with Max, I think, weekly. And you can bring him any question. Max has something to say about it. And
I will say, whenever Doug one-on-one came up on my calendar, I felt like I had to go get gym clothes on, because it was always a mental push to be able to answer everything there. But that's what I love about the one-on-ones, is that like, I'm here to help, right? And if help to you means learning more about the industry and asking, non-code related questions, great. Like, let's dive into that. If help to you means I'm stuck on line 29, I have no idea what's wrong with this, great, let's dive into that, right? And once that initial one-on-one is the hardest one to get over. Once you figure out how you get value out of them, all of a sudden scheduling them becomes a lot easier. And those one-on-ones can change, right? If you come in and go, well, this one's really code related this time, but next time I've got some general topic that I would like to talk about, that's also totally fine. I'm your mental health counselor for coding. Come in, the couch is open, door is open.
super valuable. I can't stress enough, schedule one-on-ones. It's really one of the most valuable parts of this curriculum.
Speaking of one-on-ones, Doug, I will be scheduling one with you very soon. So just letting you know.
Awesome. Well, I have you
Check my
guys.
Calendly.
I have you guys over for class tonight. I do have to check to see if OpenHack is this upcoming Thursday. I will have an answer for you guys tomorrow on that. And that will kind of shift what we're doing on tomorrow based off of whether or not I have 1 or 2 more nights with you. Ryan is coming in
from them that it's the 8th.
Oh, okay. Okay. Then we will plan on going then, and I will let Ryan know, because I am out the next 2 weeks because Ryan's teaching API stuff. With that said, I am still available for one-on-ones, not during class time. But if you would like to schedule with me for any of the stuff that Ryan is teaching or any stuff that we've covered already, I am still available for one-on-one. So I don't want you to think that just because I'm not in class, I'm not available. My Calendly stays up to date. Okay, we're way over. I will see you guys all tomorrow. And yep,
Sorry,
go ahead.
before everyone leaves, if you guys, if you do end up doing the, going to the,
Advent of
um,
Code.
yes. If you want to bring, like, if you guys do want to do like a get together, kind of like our Christmas kind of party, if you want to bring something, I plan on bringing something. If anyone else wants to as well, I think that would be a great idea.
I'm gonna really bring in coquito and arroz con dulce.
Like food.
Oh, snap. Okay. I'll bring beer again because I'm good at that. Also, if
I'll bake
anyone wants to
cookies.
do Advent of Code work together throughout the 25 days before December 9th, I believe, my company just went over it. Let me know and we can exchange some stuff. I got a whole group of work that's working on it as well.
You can also do one-on-ones for Advent of Code.
Okay. Awesome. All right,
I
everyone.
mean, I'm not personally doing them, but I can help you on the problem if you get stuck somewhere.
You don't want to win the new Kirby game?
Oh, when you get to day 20, I remember getting to day like 11 or 12 and being like, shit, I can't do this. Like,
Yeah.
I got to look up things on how to get to this level. So it ramps up very exponentially in level of difficulty. So day 1, you're like, oh yeah, this is great. I spent 20 minutes on it. And then you get to like day 9 and you're like, oh my God, I'm 100 lines of code in and I still don't know what I'm doing. So it's a great challenge to push yourself, but if you would like to go over that, one-on-ones are totally open for that as well.
They said that less than 10 people completed it last year, so
It
all of
is
the challenges,
very
so,
challenging, yes.
yeah.
But it does ramp up, so it is a good thing to get your feet wet and practice and get your way up to that.
Mhm.
Okay, I will see you guys all tomorrow.